We have a very special guest today, Hayden VK7HH. And Hayden produces another YouTube channel. It's fast growing, it's got over 500 subscribers, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But I thought we'd talk a little bit about how we got started in amateur radio. I'll interview Hayden, and Hayden will interview me. Yeah, over to you, Hayden. How did you get started in amateur radio?
Well, Peter, like a lot of people, I got started with the Funway projects, so the Dick Smith Funway projects, Funway 1 and 2. Funway 1 was, I started with the breadboards.
Oh, yeah.
You mentioned to me earlier that they used to be done on wooden breadboard, well, pieces of wood, but mine were actually done on proper plastic breadboards.
Yeah, that's not proper. Wood is the proper method.
And then I migrated onto Funway 2, which was the solderable ones. That started the interest in electronics.
Now, could you, because we have a lot of overseas viewers, they probably don't know what Funway 1 and Funway 2 was, so maybe you could talk about what that is.
So Funway was an introduction to electronics through kits that were developed by Dick Smith Electronics here in Australia.
Not many people realise that the idea came from a book, the Modern World Book of Hobbies, that was given to me in 1952. I would have been 8 years of age. It allowed me to make a 2-valve radio without using a soldering iron by screwing the parts into a bit of timber, and that's where the Funway kit came from and the Funway idea.
You were able to purchase these kits for a fairly cheap price, weren't they? The good thing about the kits, though, is that they come with all the components that you needed. You didn't have to go and individually buy the components, and that sort of just started my interest in electronics at the time, and this is going back probably about 20 years ago now, I think.
Myself, very similar, started with a crystal set, basically electrical bits. You know, I was given a soldering iron when I was about 8, I think, and various electrical wires. A lot of people were throwing out transistor radios and TVs, so it'd always have old stuff that you could pull apart. And the rubbish tip, we lived near rubbish tip, so you could just go down there and go into the pit amongst the tepid water and the dead sheep. Well, maybe not quite, but it was pretty smelly sometimes, but it was worth it hauling some of the stuff that we found.
Now, you mentioned about crystal sets, so that was my first ever project that I did in that Funway series. It was a 27 megahertz crystal set.
And did it work?
No, it didn't. It didn't work, and I was very disappointed, but the reason it didn't work was because of my education about it. 27 megahertz was it was popular, but it was probably starting to wane in interest a little bit, and I think I built it as well I would have built it in the middle of winter, and at that time there was not a lot of activity on 27 megs.
Yes, I had some disappointing kit experiences myself. I think my first kit, I was given a wireless microphone kit, so that's where I think I got my book. It was very simple, but it was soldering, and for quite a few years I absolutely hated soldering. I did try and salvage solder. I tried to salvage solder off the circuit boards of old TVs and carry the solder on the tip of my iron to things, and anyway, I was terrible soldering for quite a few years, and so I built a lot of things with breadboards and bits of wood, and you'd need these obscure screw cup washer things. You'd find that hardware store and basically washers under the screw. There are a lot of books by George Dobbs as well. Some of his simple electronic books. I had Making a Transistor Radio. I didn't actually build that radio, but that used things like OC44 transistors that I was managed to salvage, and built some regenerative sets out of those, and was even fiddling with valves. My first transmitter was actually a valve transmitter. I tried transistor ones, but they didn't work, but the valve one did. So yeah, that's how I got on air with a 1-valve crystal-controlled transmitter on 80 metres. And as it happened, the local WIA broadcast callback was on 3580, the same frequency as the crystal that you could get cheaply. So Hayden, what was your first amateur contact like?
So I suppose we'll go into how I got interested in amateur radio. So a couple of my uncles both were licensed, and they in turn got licensed due to their uncle who actually lived in the United Kingdom. So one day I remember, I think I was about probably 9 or 10 years old, I went to visit one of them one day, and he had this radio sitting on the bench, and he put the headset on, and I was hearing all these stations. I think I heard a station in the UK, and I thought, well, this is great. So anyway, from there I managed to get my amateur license and studied for it. again, through lack of education, I ended up putting up a 15-metre dipole, which I didn't make many contacts. But then some local amateurs helped me where I live, and they gave me a built 80-metre dipole. And then when I got on 80 metres, it was like, whoa, all these people to talk to. And I do remember my first contact. It was with one of those amateurs that helped me. It was in the middle of the day, and he said it was a good signal, and said that it said welcome to Amateur Radio, basically.
And what was his call sign?
His call sign was VK7HH, Gary. He still lives down in Hobart, Tasmania, where I'm from.
Ah, yes, I have contacted Gary, yeah.
Yeah, so Gary was good. So yeah, he was my first ever amateur radio contact on 80 metres.
Oh, wonderful, yeah. My first was basically calling in Morse to a gathering just before the Sunday morning broadcast went to air, and I stuck around and was able to be heard 250 kilometres away. So I had some contacts, cross mode usually. I was on CW and the other guy was on SSB on 80 metres. So that was my first contacts.
So just on that too, for some of your international viewers as well, the old licence class, when I first got my licence, Morse code was not a requirement. It was the lowest class of licence that you could get. So my contact was on voice. I never learnt Morse. I wish I did, and I do have it as a goal to do in the future. So I do know some characters, mainly due to my interest in repeaters and doing IDs. So I do know, for instance, VK7 and R. They're the main ones. But after that, then I start to struggle a little bit.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, we'll talk about repeaters later on. One of the things that a lot of viewers found amateur radio has been helpful in life, getting a job or opportunities. How has that worked out for you?
Yeah, so one of the things that I wanted to do was to do something in related to electronics. Having that amateur ticket allowed me to continue to develop my interest in it. What I ended up doing was after I'd left school, during school there wasn't an awful lot of learning about electronics. There was a couple of short courses, but by the time I got to those, they were fairly basic because of what I'd already learnt. So after that I did a vocational course, and that was in electrical actually. But then from what led on from there is I ended up managing to get employment as a electronics apprentice at the University of Tasmania.
Fantastic. My first job wasn't in electronics, but later on I started work for Dick Smith Electronics, selling all the little bits and components and ham radio stuff. In fact, the reason why I am in Victoria was because that job brought me down here. I was in Canberra at the time and had a choice of Sydney and Melbourne, and house prices were a bit cheaper here, so I came down here. And so yeah, I was there for about 7 years, and then they started going more into the consumer electronics. Luckily I got out at a good time, but yeah, for about 6 or 7 years I was employed in electronics, and ham radio was a big part of that.
Yeah, and I think that it's been very handy to have that knowledge from learning your amateur ticket, because then it allows you to just keep that interest going. Even if you're in the workplace, sometimes it can get a little bit, or it depends on what the job is, it can get a bit mundane. But yeah, it does help to have a bit of a tinker on the weekends as well.
Oh, definitely. So a lot of people have office work, so they're manufacturing less. So yeah, I think that it gives a bit of a relief to actually be doing stuff with your hands. So tips for people getting into amateur radio. You know, a lot of viewers are people just starting into amateur radio. One of my books is 99 Things You Can Do with Amateur Radio, so that brings a lot of people to the channel. So what are your tips, Hayden?
Well, I think if you've got any sort of interest in electronics at all, it is a good thing to investigate amateur radio, because
and it's just so simple now.
Yeah, it is. So here in Australia we have three licence classes, Foundation, Standard and Advanced. Foundation's a very good entry level for those that are looking to get into amateur radio. Overseas there's other licence classes. I can't remember off the top of my head the American ones for ARRL.
Yeah, the American have the technician class,
That's right.
Then the general, then the extra, and there's a lot of great online ways you can study for the tech class, and then you can go up to general if you want. But yeah, the technician class over there gives you a lot of VHF, UHF privileges, as well as a bit of HF on Morse code operating. But yeah, our foundation actually gives a little bit more than the American tech. We give you voice privileges on the HF band, so even with a foundation license you can talk for hundreds of kilometres quite easily. In fact, even thousands of kilometres if the conditions are right.
Yeah, and if you are interested in any of, well, anything to do with amateur radio, find your nearby club. Just pop it into Google, your nearest city or town, and just put in amateur radio club nearby and just find it, and then turn up and see what it's all about.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of resources in Australia. There's the WIA website, in America ARRL. I think they have a listing of radio clubs, UK RSGB. So yeah, there's a lot of radio clubs. Some of them run study courses for the ham license, or you can study independently. There's some book like by Ron Bertrand, VK2DQ, that Big Thick Radio Theory Handbook. I reviewed that in another video. That's also good for people getting into radio.
And you've got an entry level book on the way, or you've got one out, or?
Well, we won't talk about that yet, but you never know that there might be something. So just watch this space.
Edit that bit out.
Well, so when people get their license, what do you think are tips to keep their interests up and keep them going?
I think once you've started, pick a specific part of the hobby to concentrate on. So there's many different bits that people get interested in. HF could be just making contacts if you want. It could be contests. There's a lot of people that are interested in those. Satellites are another good thing. So satellites are an interesting one that it seems to always hook people.
Yeah. You can do that on a foundation license just with a Chinese handheld, and a $50 handheld, and you can be heard by the satellite. Hearing the satellite is a little bit harder, but anyway, that's another story.
And you can make a contact via the satellite, someone several hundred kilometres or miles away, depending on the height.
Like 3,000. New Zealand is easy.
Yeah, depending on the height of the satellite, of course, and the pass and everything. So yeah, maybe even looking at that, and then once you've finished in one particular aspect of amateur radio that you've sort of, maybe the interest starts to wane, then have a look at another bit and just have a go at that.
Yeah, Hayden, I understand that your interests have varied over your time. Like, what are they now?
So now, my main interest really is weak signal, so VHF and above. Only just very recently I've started looking at microwaves, so 1.2 the gigahertz and above. And I'd been thinking for a lot of years of doing it, but I'd never gotten around to doing it, but I just decided one day to look into it. So weak signal. I've always had an interest in building repeaters and how they operate on the VHF and UHF bands. Those, and along with the weak signal as well, is things like Whisper digital modes, FT8 and JT65.
Now, I believe you've also got a remote station project. What's that all about?
So that remote station is on 3 bands, 2 metres, 70 centimetres and 1.2 gigahertz, and that's controlled using a product called Remote Rig. So basically it's an FT857 for those that know that. The remote body sits at the remote site, and the head sits at my home QTH. It's connected using an internet connection, and I can remotely control everything. Rotator, I've got a computer, so I've got digital modes there as well. The reason for doing that is that my location where I live is not very good for VHF and UHF. It's in a valley. Yeah. So I decided to put this remote station up on top of a hill, and then I can make lots of long distance contacts on VHF and above.
Fantastic. And what about Whisper, Weak Signal Propagation Report? You've done quite a bit of work there.
Yeah, on my channel I've released a couple of videos to do with Whisper, as you've done as well.
Yes, in fact it was from this very point that I was transmitting that I think you picked me up on 6 metres or something, and I was just having an antenna just tied to the fence, and you managed to get me over 400 kilometres.
Yeah, and I also picked you up from the remote station as well when you were portable at the beach, I think on 2 metres.
I was down the beach, I was holding this antenna, just a 2-element Yagi, and it was amazing.
Peter was doing all the hard work. I was sitting on a chair at home, controlling the remote station. But no, Whisper is very good because it can be left unattended. So that way you can, obviously everyone lives busy lives. We can't be doing amateur radio all the time. But it's also handy to predict if propagation is just starting up, or if the band's open for a possible voice contact or something like that.
Wonderful. And tell me a bit more about the repeaters that you've built.
built my first repeater in 2007. The reason for that was, again, where I lived in a valley. There was no coverage. I had no one to talk to, and there was quite a few others who lived with me in the valley, and they also had nobody to talk to. So yeah, I built this repeater, and through the help of some other amateurs as well that were very accommodating, we managed to get it up on top of a mountain. Fast forward quite a few more years, and about 3 or 4 or maybe 5 or 6 repeaters later, I've built now repeaters on every band from 10 metres through to 70 centimetres. So yeah, it's been rather interesting. Learnt an awful lot of things as well, and it's just good to hear them in use. I've got a 6 metre repeater, and when you start to hear VK4s or Queensland stations, they're from where my 6 metre repeater is, they're about probably 1,800 kilometres away. You get a bit of a thrill that they're using what you built from scratch, basically.
Yeah, it must be one wonderful feeling. A bit like, home brewing as well. I find when you build a transceiver, you work someone with something that you built yourself, even though they're not very far away, that's a great thrill. And it might only be, say 20 or 30 bits you put together the previous afternoon.
And in regards to that home brewing, so with some of them I've built everything, including a cavity filter or a duplexer. I just made that out of old bits of coax and a couple of capacitors. So to see that actually working and how it all goes together is really quite interesting, and you learn an awful lot.
And adjusting those things can be a bit of a pain, can't it?
Yes, and if you bump them, then it throws the tuning out. So if you tune it perfectly on the bench and then you take it up to the repeater site over a rough road, then you get to the repeater site and you realise that all of a sudden it's way out of tune.
Are all those things silver plated, or is it copper, or what are they made of?
I've got a couple of duplexes which were commercially made, so they are silver plated, but the one that I made was basically out of LDF 750, Andrew's LDF 750, so just copper tube inside a dielectric, and it was very easy to solder to, which was good.
Fantastic, and I occasionally travel down to the Huon Valley, and I'm actually quite amazed at the amount of local amateur activity there is. It's surprising.
The repeater network that we've got there consists, I think, of about 5 or 6 repeaters linked around the whole state. The state's a relatively large place, a lot of mountains, and we provide coverage in 3 cities, the 3 major cities across Tasmania. So basically, when someone talks into one repeater, they come out on all the others.
So, contrary to popular belief, the South End do actually talk to the North End.
Yeah, there's a bit of an ongoing joke in the state that there's a feud between the North and South End of the state, but we definitely do talk.
That's great to hear. Both of us got into ham radio fairly young. I got my novice when I was 13, and yourself?
So mine was novice limited. So Peter, with novice, that would have been, you would have learnt CW with that.
That's right, yeah.
And I think, trying to remember, I think you had a couple of extra privileges, a couple of extra bands, was it, with novice?
Yeah, with the original novice, which was introduced in the 70s, we had 80 metres, 15 metres and 10 metres. No VHF. That came later on in 1988, but yeah, when I started it was just HF, so we couldn't actually talk to limited, which was the no code license with the advanced theory. They were all on VHF and UHF, so 2 groups in amateur radio couldn't talk to each other until novices were given 2 metres in 1988.
I was licensed in 2004 as my novice limited, so that was 80 metres, 15 metres, 10 metres and 2 and 70 centimetres, yeah. And we had a power limit of
10 watts on FM and 30 on SSB.
That's right, yes. I was trying to remember myself. And I do remember my first contact on VHF as well. I was loaned a 2-metre radio by someone, a little 10-watt unit, and I made lots of contacts on the repeaters and also simplex. So going back to what you said too about tips for those that are interested in radio, if you know someone who's interested as well, just ask them, and also when you get newly licensed, they might even lend you a radio or help you build an antenna too. Yeah,
definitely. Talking about newly licensed, young people getting into amateur radio, is it a waste of time? Should they do it? And what fun can happen if you take the plunge and get an amateur radio ticket?
I think there's an awful lot that you can learn. You can spend a lot of time as well on it. It's quite an interesting concept that I didn't really think about until just recently. On one of my videos, I interviewed a young amateur who's sort of a bit of a celebrity. His name is Jet, and the way he explained it, he said that it was the original social media, which I thought was an interesting way that he said that. So obviously we've got, you know, lots of social media platforms, but it can be just as fun experimenting with amateur radio as it is to maybe be on Facebook or Instagram, and you get to actually do and build your own things as well and make a lot of great friendships too with other people.
Yeah, it's wonderful, especially if you're interested in the technique of communication, more than the message. Like, you can't talk to random friends on it if they are not also amateur radio licensed, but if you're into the nuts and bolts, how it's done, and you can be up on some remote summit or somewhere where there's no mobile coverage. It's basically having your own network that's independent of, you know, NBN, your phone networks. It's basically self-contained, and you can mess around with communication links. If you're into computer data, you can have more power than what is allowed than if you're just using the class license type stuff. That's the stuff that you can use without a license. With amateur radio, you get a lot more power. You can transmit video pictures at higher power. Have you done much video transmitting?
No, I haven't. So that was one thing that is on the to-do list, maybe digital amateur TV. So down where I live there is a club that does digital amateur TV, a lot of experimenting with that, so that's always fun. You mentioned about getting outdoors and on summits and things, so that's another good thing for young people is that they can get out and about. I know that recently in the United States they had the ARRL Field Day. People get outdoors, they go away for the weekend and they bring all of their radio gear, they set it up portable somewhere, and they just camp out and make contacts and try to make as many contacts as possible.
Most countries have their own field days, and even when it's not a field day, you can just get out, get on air and get contact. And it's amazing what you can hear and who can hear you when you get out and about.
I've got another question for you. What projects are you working on at the moment, and what ones have you got in the pipeline?
I've recently been experimenting with audio induction loop receivers. I've done 1 or 2 videos on it. It's to mainly record train announcements for another hobby. But yeah, an induction loop receiver is basically a powerful low noise audio amplifier with a little coil that allows you to pick up induction loop things, and they are transmitted for the benefit of people that have hearing aids. If they've got a T-coil in them, then they'll be able to hear announcements without all the extraneous noise that you'd get in a public place. I suppose you could say it's a form of receiving, or at least wireless. I've been having a lot of fun, and I've just recently built something that is only about the size of your little finger, but it just plugs into a mobile phone and you're able to make recordings of those announcements.
Oh, that sounds pretty cool. Not sort of radio related, but definitely electronic related.
Definitely wireless anyway, yeah. Now, Hayden, you have a YouTube channel. Could you tell us a little bit about it and where people can find it?
So my YouTube channel is called Ham Radio DX. You can search for Ham Radio DX or my call sign VK7HH or VK7HH. So like Peter's VK3YE, just pop that into YouTube. My videos mainly consist of the projects that I've been doing, the interests that I've got, much like yourself. There's a little bit of homebrew, not an awful lot of homebrew, but yeah, I'm just sort of experimenting with some of the different topics.
And there's also some live Q&As recently as well.
Yeah, so I've been doing a lot of Q&As, a lot of live streams, and just answering some questions as well. Check that out and subscribe, then I'd be very grateful. I'm also on Facebook as well, and Instagram and all those other places, so just do a search for Ham Radio DX and you should find me there as well.
Thanks, Hayden. Welcome to Melbourne, and thanks for being a guest, and enjoy your travels and adventures here.
Thanks, Peter. Just before we go too, so the reason that I'm actually in Melbourne as well is for GippsTech, which is held annually. This is the first time that I've been to GippsTech, so basically it's microwaves and above. So looking forward to some interesting talks by some amateurs on that. Perhaps a bit of luck, we might have a little bit of content on my YouTube channel as well to do with that. Yeah, looking forward to that.
Fantastic. Thanks, Hayden, and enjoy GippsTech.
Thanks, Peter.